You should be able to see on one side of your screen a navigation area which will allow you to ask questions. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask during the webinar, please just type those in under the questions section. We'll receive those here, and any that are relevant from an overall point of view I'll address at the end. If you have anything that is particularly site-specific, then I'll get back to you separately rather than trying to cover those off in front of everybody. So feel free to ask questions. If you have to drop out, or if you, for some reason, you lose connection to this webinar, we are recording this, and we'll make the recording available on our website later on this week, which will be able to be downloaded and listened to again at your leisure. If you have a problem with sound, it is possible to phone in. There's a phone number that's available, and you can phone in and get the sound through that rather than having it directly over the internet. Okay, so what am I going to cover off today? We've got about 20-25 minutes to go through the presentation and then cover off some questions afterwards. So I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the company and myself, go through the relevant directive, the European directive, and the regulations fairly briefly, because I suspect that most people that are logging on, that are listening, will be familiar with the regulations and the directive, but I'll go through that quite quickly. The main focus really then is going to be on recent and planned changes to the regulations and also the European directive. Talk a little bit about changes in government structure and how that impacts bottled water companies in the UK, and a little bit on consultations as well, with a couple of little tips of how to make sure that you're getting information, up-to-date information from the government. And I'll summarize very briefly at the end with my kind of top tips of things that bottled water manufacturers should be doing in the UK to make sure they're staying abreast of the best information. Zenith International, we're a consultancy to the food and drinks industry worldwide. Just over 20 years old now. We're an entirely independent company based here in Bath in the UK. We have regional offices in other parts of the world. We work for a whole range of beverage clients all over the world. Our focus really is in beverages and dairy. We do work in food, but the focus is really beverages and dairy. Myself, my name is Dr. Rick Horobin. I run the Water and Environment Group at Zenith International. My background is in geophysics, and I'm a hydrogeologist by training. I've worked in the bottled water industry for just over 10 years now. That's enough about us. To start with, and I know this will be familiar to a lot of people, but I can see that we've got some people who may or may not be quite so familiar with this, is just to go through in the UK the three main product descriptors for bottled waters. The first one, and I suppose the top in some senses, is a natural mineral water. And a mineral water is a water that is fully protected and from an officially recognized source that's been recognized by the local authority. The chemistry and the microbiology of that water is inherently stable over time. There are limits on a range of parameters, on some toxic parameters. There is minimal treatment that's allowed to mineral waters, and I'll talk a little bit more about that a bit later on in the webinar. And the other part about mineral water that's important is that a mineral water source is linked to a particular product, a particular brand, and only that brand can be bottled from that particular source. The next descriptor is spring water, which again has to be from a protected source, although there is a subtle differentiation in the regulations between fully protected and protected. The spring water has to be microbiologically safe at the time of bottling, and that's a subtle distinction as well, whereas a natural mineral water has to be microbiologically safe at all times. There are limits on quite a wide range of parameters, and that's controlled by the European Directive on the Quality of Water Intended for Human Consumption. There are treatments that are allowed for spring water. It's not entirely clear exactly what treatments are allowed. Certain EHOs, environmental health officers, will apply it in a slightly different way, but there are some treatments that are allowed. It's also possible to produce a bottled drinking water from the same source that a spring water is produced from. And the principle there is that a spring water is only a spring water because you put it in a bottle and call it a spring water, which might sound slightly mad, whereas a mineral water, all the water that comes from that source, if it goes into a bottle as a water, is natural mineral water. The third descriptor then is bottled drinking water, which is basically everything else. You can take a bottled drinking water from any source. It doesn't matter where it comes from. The important thing about a bottled drinking water is that it's the quality of the water in product or in bottle that is important. So it has to be microbiologically safe in bottle, and there are limits on a range of parameters which are basically the same as those for spring waters. There's no limit on treatment, simply because there's no limit on where you can get the water from, and you can produce any number of different brands from any particular source. A bottled drinking water is only that because it's been put into a bottle and called so. Overriding the European regulations, the UK regulations, sorry, which we're talking about today, are the EU directives. And there are three main EU directives that are relevant for bottled water producers. The first, and probably the main one, is the Natural Mineral Water Directive, this Directive 2009-54-EC, which was recast in 2009 from a whole bunch of amendments on the previous directive that was originally written in 1980. And that applies to natural mineral waters, and parts of it also apply to spring waters. There's a Commission directive that was drafted in 2003, which sets out the list and the limits of certain parameters for spring waters and mineral waters. It also sets out some of the labeling requirements for mineral waters, and I suppose importantly it set out the conditions for using ozone for treatment of mineral waters. That's ozone for treatment of the unstable elements of iron and manganese, for example, rather than as a disinfectant. And that directive applies to natural mineral waters and again in part to spring waters. The third EU directive that is important is Council Directive 98/83/EC, which is the quality of water intended for human consumption I referred to a minute ago, and that applies to spring waters and bottled drinking waters. It actually is the overriding directive for mains water and private water supplies across Europe as well. So they're the main EU directives, and those three directives feed down into a whole raft of UK regulation, which we'll just run through quickly now. The overriding regulation is the Natural Mineral Water, Spring Water and Bottled Drinking Water Regulations 2007, for which there are 4 separate sets of regulations for the different devolved regions. That sets out the requirements for producing product as those 3 different product descriptors. The 2007 regulations, since they were written, have been amended several times, 4 times in fact. The first amendment was in 2009, which was a fairly minor amendment and really changed the main change was changing a reference from the old European directive to the new European directive. There was a minor change in the definition of natural mineral water to bring it in line with Europe, and that simply was a change. There's a minor description in the regulations from the original state to original purity, which has effectively no consequential impact on producers. And again, there was a minor change to labeling requirements. None of them were anything particularly major. The regulations were amended again twice in 2010. One of those regulations was simply minor corrections to the 2007 regulations, but it also introduced the use of activated alumina for the treatment of fluoride, which we'll talk about very briefly in a minute. There was a further amendment in 2011, came into effect around about April, and that allowed the use of languages other than English on labels of bottled drinking water, mineral water and spring water in the UK. It also changed references from the agency, and that's the Food Standards Agency, to the Secretary of State. And I'll talk just briefly about that in a moment. Okay, so UK government structure. There was a big change to the UK government obviously last year with the coalition coming in. One of the things that the coalition did was look to try and cut costs, and at the time there was a discussion about whether the Food Standards Agency, the FSA, should be entirely disbanded. As it ended up, the FSA still exists, although it has a smaller remit now. It is now in England no longer responsible for managing the bottled water regulations, the overriding regulations. However, in the three devolved regions, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the FSA still exists and still has responsibility for those regulations. Food safety in the UK is a devolved responsibility. What happened was that the UK government decided to pass over responsibility for bottled waters in England to DEFRA, so that now, rather than the FSA, DEFRA is the responsible organisation for recognition of non-EEA, the European Economic Area, mineral waters across the whole of the UK. They also have responsibility for managing bottled water regulations in England. Effectively, what will happen is that DEFRA will feed through to the FSA in the other regions, and any changes to the European directive that feed through into the UK regulations will fall through DEFRA to the FSA in the different regions. That change from the FSA to DEFRA, I think it's fair to say that when it happened a year ago, less than a year ago, was challenging, and there was a period of time when it was difficult to find exactly the information that one might want about bottled water, the regulations and such like. DEFRA has now increased the level of information on its website, and I think that they've done a reasonable job about making sure that the information that was previously on the FSA's website is now available on DEFRA's website. And equally, the information that was on the FSA's website is now no longer there. There was a period of time when if you searched for bottled water, it took you through to bottled water and the page was blank. If you searched for spring water, it took you through to bottled water and the page was blank, for example. That now no longer exists. Okay, so moving on to allowable treatments. This is something that can cause some confusion, and actually I still personally don't think is entirely clear. There is a process within the European directive to add allowable treatments for natural mineral waters, and that's basically to allow treatments for the list of toxic parameters that a natural mineral water has to adhere to. That process is done at a European level and then passed down through changes to the directive to the various different countries. It's not an entirely straightforward process. It can take quite a long time. We've had a recent change for the use of activated alumina, which has been ongoing for several years. So it's a process by which you tend to get a fair amount of warning, but it is a process that's there to add these allowable treatments. As I said, those treatments that are authorised at an EU level would then pass down through changes in the UK regulations to become law in the UK. The major change really last year to the natural mineral water regulations was the use now of activated alumina as a treatment for the removal of fluoride. Now, all of the treatments that are allowed for natural mineral water explicitly say that there must be no disinfecting action, and that's simply because one of the points about a mineral water is that it's being consumed in product as it came out of the ground.